Right. This lecture is going to talk about the northern colonies of the northern region of the English colonies. So in the southern colonies and in Jamestown, we were looking at kind of the Virginia, Maryland region. This is going to look at the kind of region of North America that will eventually become New England. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then kind of the area that will spread around that. And what's kind of interesting about this is that even initially here, these two regions, although both English colonies, both regions are part of the English colonies that are connected to the King of England, these colonies in the north are going to come about for very different reasons than the southern colonies still. The people who come will be different, the reasons they come will be different, and as a result, the life that they set up, the society that they set up in the north will be different than the south. And so this is kind of an important idea to keep in mind throughout the class. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is who is leaving England and why. And this relates to the formation of Jamestown as well, but there's certain kind of individuals that leave England for various reasons, right? So kind of just from what you already know from the chapter readings and from the lecture on Jamestown, right? There's a couple of things happening in Europe and in England particularly that are going to start pushing people out of England, right? Having them look for other places to go because life in England has become unbearable for certain individuals, right? The first thing we know that's happening, and this is happening in all of Europe, not just England, is rapid population growth. Some of this, interestingly enough, has to do with the Columbian exchange, because when certain foods and crops were introduced back into Europe, like potatoes and corn, for example, they were much more nutritionally dense foods, and they actually contributed to an overall improvement in health and sustained populations for longer. So you actually saw a population boom in Europe as a result of those new foods. So that's the first thing. There's more people in Europe than there has been before. The second thing that happened as a result of some of the changes during this time period was inflation. After the Spanish colonies and sort of conquest of the Americas, a lot more gold and silver was introduced into Europe, and this created, it led to high rates of inflation. The prices of goods in some parts of Europe tripled, and so that made it difficult for people who already don't have a lot to be able to afford things. The third one I mentioned already, and this is probably the one that's more connected, and these are the individuals that will probably go to the southern colonies and to Jamestown, is there's sort of a massive movement in England that's pushing people off of their land. And peasants, poor people, rural people are losing their land all over England. This had to do with the growing industrial emphasis in England and the need for wool for the textile industry. And so as there's an increased demand for wool, they need to graze more sheep for the wool. And so people that were kind of poor tenant renting, tenant farmers are being kicked off their land. It was known as the enclosure movement. They were closing off more land for sheep grazing. As a result of the enclosure movement, a lot of peasants packed up their bags and came to the Americas to become indentured servants. And then in the 1640s, there's another factor that's pushing some people out of Europe, and this is what's significant for understanding the northern colonies, and that's religion, right? There's going to be a religious revolution happening in England, and you're going to see some people who are basically refugees, people who are fleeing England for either because they're being persecuted for their religious views, or because they're no longer able to live in England and successfully practice their religious faiths. So these are some of the facts. These are some of the things happening in Europe, and these are some of the things that are affecting our migrants. So just really briefly, what are some of what is this sort of religious revolution that's happening in Europe, well, the sort of main thing that's happening in Europe is what's known as the Protestant Reformation. And this begins about 1500 to the 1620s. And essentially, this actually goes way back to the Crusades. So, way back to 1020, really. After the Crusades, there's a lot of division in Europe over the issue of religion. The Crusades really opened up the fact that there were a lot of problems in the Catholic Church. If you went way back, you had the Roman Empire, and basically Europe was largely Catholic for all of this time, including England up until Henry VIII. So, after the Crusades in Europe, some kings and queens and monarchies that were Catholic monarchies, there's a lot of corruption in the church, and basically beginning in the 1500s, you have some individuals that are really starting to criticize the Catholic Church, right? Most of the criticism focused on the church hierarchy, the sort of popes and bishops and cardinals, the sort of the politics of the Catholic Church. So this is known as the Protestant Reformation. They call it Protestant, right? Because so basically anything non-Catholic is viewed as Protestant. Protestant meaning protest, right? These are people who are protesting Protestants. So the kind of first individual who's really viewed as kind of revolutionary in this movement, in the Protestant Reformation, is actually a German monk, it's a Catholic priest, right, named Martin Luther. And in 1517, he published what he called the 95 Theses, and it was sort of the 95 problems that he felt were wrong with the Catholic Church, the things he felt needed to be reformed, right? These are people that are basically calling for reform of the church and change. I won't touch on all of them, right, but a couple of the things that he talks about in the 95 Theses, he's critical of what's known as the sale of indulgences, right? In the Catholic Church, they have something known as, there's a belief in confession, right? And that you can sort of, you go sort of tell your priest your problems, and then there's some kind of penance, right? What was happening in the Catholic Church is that very wealthy individuals were actually buying, it's kind of, they're buying, they're paying to have their sins the cleansing of their sins, right? So this is something that he's very critical of. This is not something you can just buy. It's something that you have to work at in other ways, right? He was also critical of the view that the Catholic Church held about priests, right? The belief that a priest was a mediator between the people and God. He will emphasize the instruction in the Bible and reading the Bible as being as important, if not more important, than some of the rituals that the Catholic Church performed. If you're familiar with the Catholic Church, what Martin Luther was criticizing as the rituals are, in the Catholic Church, really viewed as, the sacraments and the sort of, and not only that, but some of the rituals that are performed during the Catholic church ceremony. So he was saying that sort of the reading and the studying of the Bible are more important than these things, and that's his view at the time. As a result, because he's saying that the Bible it's important that you read and study the Bible, he felt that the Bible should be accessible to more people. And at that time, the original Bible is written in Hebrew and Koine Greek. The New Testament would have been written traditionally in Koine Greek. A lot of people think it was Latin, but it was not written Latin. The spoken language of the Roman Empire was Latin, and so that's what some of the Catholic Church services were. But so the only people that would have been able to read the Bible in its original translation would have been people that were like theologians, people that studied and were literate and educated. And that's why priests had to attend seminary to be able to do that. The Catholic Church felt that it was really important to read the original translation, which some people agree because things can change in translation. But Luther felt that it shouldn't only be the priests who get to read the Bible, and so therefore he felt that the Bible should be translated into languages that people could read themselves. And so he actually translates the Bible into German. He's German, so that Germans can read the Bible, right? So, and by the way, Martin Luther will be, his movement will sort of lead to the formation of the Lutheran Church and kind of break away from the Catholic Church. And so Luther is actually excommunicated from the church. He's not very popular with the Catholic Church, and his movement will really spread, and it will really take hold in Germany. Germans and peasants alike will rebel against the church and begin to break away from kind of the stronghold that the Catholic Church had in much of Europe. So those are some new ideas, and I don't think people really realize today it doesn't seem that revolutionary, but at the time when you've only had one religious interpretation for a long time, to now start to have people question that is pretty radical. Right? Another kind of thinker that's going to start kind of questioning the church is John Calvin. John Calvin was Swiss. He was from Switzerland, and he kind of takes what Luther says and he kind of takes it one step further. And Calvin introduces the concept of predestination into religious thinking. Predestination was the notion that one's kind of a fundamental belief in Christianity is the idea that of salvation, right? That you die and that you can go to heaven, right? This idea of being saved or having salvation. In Catholic teachings, or previous Catholic teachings, there were many different avenues to salvation. Calvin suggests that kind of God's presence, his role, is so strong that he's already predetermined who is going to heaven and who is not, right? And so that so basically the idea that you have no control, right? Everything is sort of in the hands of someone else, and that your salvation is already determined from the moment that you're born, basically. So there are some saved and not saved. Calvin is a fundamental thinker that will really influence the creation of the Presbyterian Church. So Calvin, like Luther, will start to win converts in Switzerland. Basically, these people are forming their own kind of religious churches that are practicing not what the Catholic Church not practicing the Catholic teachings. But he'll win converts all over Europe, France, Belgium, Holland. And both of these men, and the Protestant Reformation in general, is going to inspire what's known as the Puritan movement in England and Scotland. And that's important because it's the Puritans who are going to be the settlers that come to the north, to the New England colonies of North America. Right? And the Puritans are kind of a radical sect of this new kind of these new Protestants. And the Puritans were Calvinists, so they believed in that notion of predestination. And the Puritans sort of viewed themselves as these individuals that wanted to purify the church. First the Catholic Church, and then eventually when the Church of England is formed, they want to purify and kind of like eliminate what they all of the rituals that are really important for Catholics. They sort of viewed as less important and wanted to eliminate those or purify it, make the Catholic Church more simple and less of all of the rituals, less of the structure of the Catholic Church, basically moving away from all of those sorts of ideas. and basically branch off. So this is what's happening in England. You have kind of this movement that begins in Germany, and quickly it's spreading all over Europe. And as a result of all these new ideas, people are starting to say for the first time, like, okay, maybe the Catholic Church teachings are not this way. Maybe this is what's right. Maybe this is what's right. So people are beginning to question that, and as a result, all of these new religions and religious movements are emerging in Europe. Okay, and so kind of why this is all important is because it's really going to be, these individuals are the sort of Puritans are going to be the ones that will come to settle the northern colonies of New England. The reason why they will come is really different than some of the first settlers that we talked about, like those that go to Jamestown or those that will go to the Carolinas even, right? These are the reason why people come, the reason why the Puritans come is very different. Colonial New England, the Plymouth, the Massachusetts Bay colonies will be settled by religious migrants, Puritans. Puritans, there's kind of different waves of Puritans that come. The first waves that come were coming because they were actually being persecuted. If you remember, we had talked about that. There was a lot of conflict between the Protestants and the Church of England. Many of them were escaping the turmoil and persecution, and they wanted the freedom to practice their religious views freely, right? English law actually required that you attended Anglican services, the Church of England, the new kind of church. So Puritans weren't really free to actually practice their own religion in Europe. I think that's something people don't really realize, and the same in Catholic countries at that time. So these are the first settlers to New England. And the first settlement we'll see in New England, like I said, is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which will be created in 1620. And these new migrants that are coming to New England in the 1620s were what we call later the Pilgrims, right? But essentially the Pilgrims were Puritans. They were a Protestant kind of group. They had different religious views, and they wanted to separate from the Church of England. They wanted to form their own community, their own society that would be based on their religious teachings. And just like their religious views in terms of purifying the Catholic Church, what the first Puritans who came to New England wanted to do was really create a more pure version of England, right? They felt that just like the church had become corrupt, so too had English society, right? And the church, even the Church of England, because the Church of England, I don't know if you realize, is actually headed by the King of England by this time. So they wanted to kind of create a very different version in which their religious views were kind of the centerpiece of their daily lives. And it really was, which we'll talk about in a minute. Right, so the goal was to build a new, orderly, Puritan version of England. Religion and their faith would shape their daily lives and their settlement in the colonies. So in 1620, the Pilgrims come. Some of these groups had actually attempted to do this in other parts of Europe, like the Pilgrims who came. They had actually they left England and they went to Holland because there was more freedom of religion there. But one of the things they found was that even in Holland, even though they could freely practice their religious views, they felt that their children and their families were becoming corrupted by Dutch society, right? So all of the kind of bad things, the evils in everyday society. So they felt that if they could have this kind of clean slate, this new place, where not only was it about practicing your faith, but also living your religious views, living your faith, this is what they wanted. And they felt that was too difficult in Europe where it was already very corrupted. So this is kind of their goal. Now, if you compare this to the southern colonies, this is a very different intention, right? They don't plan to come here to necessarily make profit. This is really about their beliefs, right? And living their beliefs. Okay, so the founder of this first colony in 1620 was, a man named William Bradford, and he believed that settling in the New World would better preserve their community and their religion. They'll receive permission to settle they received permission from the king to settle in Virginia, but as they were traveling, they kind of went off course, and they ended up actually a little farther north in present-day Massachusetts. Right, so this is the Pilgrims that landed at Plymouth Rock and all that. Right, so this is 1620, and if you recall, Jamestown was 1607. So it's not that much later, but it's later. The southern colonies were founded first. Technically, they really have no legal rights in Massachusetts because the king had granted this area to another company, but it didn't really matter. And the way that they did this, actually, even though this is not for profit, to get the money to come to New England, these Puritan migrants actually had to get a patent from the Virginia Company, which laid claim to the land. Basically, they kind of took out a loan, right? They're going to become indebted to these Virginia Company investors, and they're going to have to sort of pay back their investors as a way to get the lease and the goods and supplies to be able to come to these New England colonies and establish themselves. So it's going to take them some time to do that. Okay, so in August of 1620, William Bradford and 37 of his followers, Bradford was a Protestant minister, they will set sail on the Mayflower. Along with them also came about 67 English migrants who were not Puritans. They were just, sailors and people interested in settling, right? And they land near present-day Cape Cod, Massachusetts. On the day that they arrived, before they even got up the ship, which is what you see in the picture on the right, William Bradford and some of the other men drafted what's known as the Mayflower Compact. And the reason why they drafted this up is that, these men sort of understood that they were heading into a kind of uncharted land, right? A place with no government, no law, no sort of order. And again, if you recall, their mission is kind of to create a very orderly, very well-organized kind of society, because that's the only way they're going to be able to live out their faith, is if they have some organization. Also, there was the soldiers on the Mayflower. These kind of other people that were non-Puritan kind of worried them a little bit, and so they wanted to kind of, basically, we got to have a game plan before we get off the ship, right? Because we got to make sure that once we get there, disaster's not going to ensue, and everybody's got to know the rules, basically. And that's kind of what the Mayflower Compact does, right? So 1620, they draft it, and basically, quoting from it, right, they pledge to, quote, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation. And as you can see, they all sign it, and you can read it in more detail. Actually, you can read it quite well. Basically saying that this is going to be a society based on Christianity. The idea being here, right, this is kind of like early democracy, really. This is kind of this idea that they're going to pledge to covenant and combine ourselves. Covenant and combine ourselves. Together into a civil body politic. This idea that we are one, right? And we are all going to agree to a basic set of rules, right? And in the thing, it's basically based on their faith, their Christian views. And through this, by basically saying, look, we are all kind of one, we're all agreeing that we are going to follow and obey the rules, right? Because that's the best way to maintain order and be able to preserve our community. And so many people sort of look at this document as being really influential. It kind of sets a tone for the future of the colonies, that these were colonies that were kind of, even though you had a royal governor and you had a lot of presence of the king, they're kind of independent, and they were independent from their formation. So that's kind of it's an interesting idea to throw out there. Okay, so they draft this, right, and it's basically saying they're going to rule themselves. It's like self-rule. Okay, and then the other key thing here is that this is going to be a society based on their religious views. Right? And much like the Jamestown settlers, it's not going to be all, like, perfect for the Pilgrims. The first winter that they're there is very difficult. Only half of the settlers actually survived to the spring. Right? Here's a quote from Bradford. First winter was most sad and lamentable. In 2 or 3 months' time, half our company died, being the depth of winter and wanting houses and other comforts, and being infected with scurvy and other diseases. So scurvy is a lack of vitamin C. It's a vitamin C deficiency, probably a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables and things like that. So it's not going well for the Pilgrims, much like the Jamestown settlers. And that's where the Wampanoag Indians come in. So unlike the Jamestown settlers, the Pilgrims are going to do their best to have good relationships with the local Indian population. And this is like the whole first Thanksgiving story, which there's not a ton of evidence to suggest it was quite the way it's retold, but we do know that the Pilgrims befriend the Wampanoag Indians, and the Wampanoag Indians, is basically thanks to them that these settlers survive, because they are going to learn from them how to set their corn, how to plant corn, where to hunt, where to fish, where to get water, how to construct their homes, right? Sort of a lot of kind of knowledge that these English, who haven't lived in this environment, don't understand, are going to be taught to them by the Indians. So that's kind of the story of the first Thanksgiving. So with the help of the Wampanoag Indians, they successfully make it through the following year, and they celebrate by this feast with the Indians. And right, so that's kind of that story. The actual historical evidence that this happened is kind of sketchy. We don't know for certain if they all gathered together. We do know, however, that the information they learned from the Indians helped them significantly. So the Pilgrims, the kind of important thing about the Pilgrims and these kind of first settlers to New England, to Massachusetts, within 20 years, this group is going to build a flourishing community. Eventually, it'll grow in size to over 300 settlers in Plymouth. They have investors they need to pay back. If you recall, that's how they were able to settle here. And so the way that the Puritans, these Pilgrims, do this is by they will build small farms. They have a few animals. They have things that they can do to kind of sustain themselves, and pay off their investors. Right? They're going to set up basically small farming communities. And because they were so obsessed with not being like England, kind of avoiding corruption was really important to these first communities of New England. And so many of them will establish legal codes like very early on, like before they even are there. Whereas in Jamestown and the southern colonies, laws kind of were like second, like an afterthought. They would come, they would arrive, things would happen, and then they would draft laws, or then they would appoint a governor. In New England, they sort of had a good system from the beginning. Right, they established a written legal code. The legal code established a form of self-government, mandated broad political rights, and rights to property ownership and religious freedom. These were kind of important to them. right? They wanted to avoid the corruption that England had had, which that was their goal from the beginning, so it makes sense. As the Pilgrims are settling in, right, in the first 20 years or so, things are actually getting worse in England for Protestants. In 1629, the King of England dissolves the Parliament. He claims authority to rule by divine right. He starts expelling hundreds of Puritan ministers, and as a result of kind of these changes, by the 1630s, we're going to start to see, which I think if we go back to our map, we're going to start to see more and more waves of religious migrants. And if you're a religious migrant, which part of the colonies are you going to go to? Are you going to go to the south, to Virginia, or are you going to go to these northern colonies, right? So most of them are going to go to the north because that's where these religious colonies already are. That's where people share many of their same views. That's where there's a good kind of system of government. So this is kind of important. So the north is going to primarily attract these religious migrants. And the differences between the religious migrants and the people that go to like Virginia and south is that these religious migrants are largely going to be made up of families, because they're entire families that are leaving England, coming to North America. Husbands, wives, children, they're all going. Whereas in the southern colonies, it was largely, if you remember, it was majority male, and you were coming to work or you were coming to make money. There were some women, and over time, obviously they're going to form families and things like that, but it's very different, right, who's coming. Okay. So more and more migrants, religious migrants, are going to come to the New England colonies. The exodus really begins in the 1630s. And there was one group in particular that will arrive in the 1630s, and they will be led by a man named John Winthrop. And John Winthrop is, there's an excerpt, a reading from one of his sermons, right, that he gives. It's known as it's called A City Upon a Hill. And you'll hear, even today in like common talk or discussion, they'll talk a lot about City Upon a Hill and sort of what use that metaphor a lot, right? So in 1630, John Winthrop drafted this, and it's kind of one of the most famous sermons probably in U.S. history, and he gives it while on passage to the New England colonies, to his followers, right? And the idea is that, right, he basically, if you've read the reading, and you should, if you haven't, you can stop the video and go read it. But basically, in City Upon a Hill, he is declaring that the Church of England is corrupt, right? And the reason why the Church of England is corrupt, and the Catholic Church, and English society, right, the reason why they're corrupt is because they've failed to basically practice what they preach. And that's what Puritans are trying to do, is to actually live what they believe, live out their views. And so for this reason, because England hasn't done this, they've become corrupted. And the whole world, he says, is deeply flawed in this way. This new society that they're going to create, that Winthrop is going to create when they arrive, is a society that will live out their teachings. And their teachings, if you recall, are based on what he says, God's laws, not man's. Right? So this is his sort of view. And he says this is only going to work if the entire community works together. And the biggest point of A City Upon a Hill, right, is that if we do this, right, if we can go and migrate to this colony and do this well and do this right, we, quote, right, he says, we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, right? So what he's saying in this piece is that this is what we believe, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to go, this is what we think is going to work. And this is what we're doing, what we're setting about doing here is really important. Because if it works, right, we will be a city upon a hill, right? A city upon a hill, the kind of metaphor being there is that something that all the world will see, right? It's kind of up on the hill, something visible to all, right? He's basically saying all the world is watching us. If this experiment works, it's a testament that our faith, our beliefs are right, essentially, that they work too. If it fails, what does that say about us and our beliefs and our religion, right? So this is really, he sort of sees it as really fundamental to kind of speaking to much larger things that are happening in the world. So, and you'll hear that metaphor a lot, City Upon a Hill. So you should review that reading. It's very good. It's very short. Right? So this belief that Winthrop has, will really shape 17th century New England, and Winthrop's vision of a city on a hill is really going to kind of fire up the Puritans and kind of give them more determination than ever that they can keep their covenant and that they can live according to, their Christian teachings, unlike some of these more corrupt parts of Europe, right? And so, therefore, given what you know now a little bit about Puritans, kind of like their faith, their religious teachings are going to affect every aspect of their life in New England, right? There's really no separation between, like, biblical teachings and daily life. Like, they're completely intertwined. Right? And so, basically, by the 1640s, 1630s, 1640s, there would be over 16,000 men and women who would be living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Most of them were people like Winthrop and his followers, people that came as families. They came with their wives, they had children, and their goal was to establish these religious communities. You can't just do that and do nothing else. Many of them will kind of form little villages. Most of those villages will be like little farming communities, little agricultural communities, to make money and to kind of pay back investors or meet expenses. We see kind of some small manufacturing that happens, artisans, things like that. But largely, New England, it looks very different. It's like family-oriented, religious-oriented. It's made up of little villages, kind of like small cities. There was longer life expectancy if you were living in the northern colonies because it wasn't based on this backbreaking labor in the plantations, right? And also the climate was different of New England, so it didn't have the same diseases and things that you saw in the South. So these are some of the reasons why these Puritans are coming.